Hello there, AP Environmental Science class. All right, welcome to my lecture on Chapter 12, Food Production and the Environment. So in this lesson, we're going to talk about how food or producing food has its negative and positive effects on the environment. And you'll probably, as you'll probably imagine, a lot of the industrialized food production that we are currently doing around the world actually doesn't help the environment that much. So we're going to talk about that as we go through this lecture. Now, there are about 82 slides to this chapter. Unlike, though, Chapter 10, I am going to try to do this lecture in two parts. So there'll be 40 slides or so for each part, so maybe a couple of minutes longer than usual, but I am going to try to do Chapter 12 here again in just two parts. So this is Part 1, Food Production and the Environment. All right, as always, we start off with a core case study talking about growing power and urban food oasis. So what is a food desert? A food desert is an urban area where people have little or no easy access to nutritious food. However, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a guy by the name of Will Allen produced or came up with something called Growing Power Incorporated. This is an ecologically based farm using solar power, produces 150 varieties of organic produce. Nutrients are recycled in creative ways, and it provides education and training in organic farming methods. And what's great about this actually is done in an urban setting. Here is Will Allen himself, again, who founded a Growing Power Inc., which is an urban farm in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And that's what we're going to talk about in this lecture, more creative ways we need to come up with to produce the amount of food that we need to feed all the people that we have on this planet. Because unfortunately, the way we're feeding people now with the industrialized food production is unfortunately doing more harm than it's doing good. So why is good nutrition important? Well, many people in less developed countries have health problems from not getting enough food. And I would argue even here in the United States, we're one of the richest countries in the world. And unfortunately, we have an issue with people going hungry every night as well, even here in Westchester County. That's why organizations like the Westchester Food Pantry and things like that are so important. Many people in more developed countries suffer health problems from eating too much. So believe it or not, there's actually both sides of this story, right? You can have health problems from eating, not having enough good nutrition. You could also have health problems from eating too much. Greatest obstacles to providing enough food for everyone: poverty, war, bad weather, and climate change. And we'll talk about those in more detail as we go through this lecture. So here's a picture. It's tough to see, guys. There are going to be some pictures in this chapter that are going to be tough to watch as a parent. Very difficult to see, but this is a mother trying to feed her starving child in Somalia. This is in Africa, and as you can see, that child is unfortunately having starvation issues. You could see how skinny and how emaciated that person is. So again, tough to see, but unfortunately, these are the things that are going on around the world. And it's you guys. You guys are coming. You're going to be the next generation here. You unfortunately need to see this. You need to see this, these tough pictures, so that you can hopefully solve many of these world's problems. So many people suffer from lasting hunger and malnutrition. All right, just a couple of terms to understand. We have what are known as macronutrients. All right, macro meaning large. These are your carbohydrates, your proteins, and your fats. And then we have micronutrients, all right, which are smaller. These are your vitamins like vitamin A, B, C, and E, or minerals like iron, iodine, and calcium. And obviously, these nutrients, if you have either macro or micro, if you have a lack of one of these nutrients, these vitamins, these minerals, for instance, this could lead to lasting hunger and malnutrition. Chronic undernutrition is when you do not have enough food to meet your basic energy needs, okay? So that is what's known as chronic undernutrition. Chronic malnutrition is not enough protein or other key nutrients, all right? So just understand the difference between undernutrition and malnutrition. What is famine? Famine is a severe shortage of food, usually due to crop failures, due to drought, flooding, or potentially war. And those famines can cause mass starvation, deaths, economic chaos, and and social disruption. We have famines all the time, and the idea is to try to figure out how to produce enough food so that we don't have to deal with famines in any part of the world. That's obviously what we're trying to get to. So let's take a look at those micronutrients a little closer. Those were the vitamins and minerals we spoke about. 2 billion people are deficit in either one or more vitamins and minerals. Too little iron is something causes anemia. Anemia, actually, my grandmother suffered from anemia. So you may know someone, maybe even yourself, who suffers from too little iron. That's called anemia. And what you would get is just an iron supplement, some kind of vitamin or supplement that would increase the iron. Iodine is essential for thyroid function. So the chronic lack of iodine would cause stunted growth, mental retardation, and something called goiter. All right, you are going to need to understand some of these micronutrients and again what their effects are. So definitely put this to memory. Again, too little iron causes anemia. Too little iodine can basically disrupt the thyroid function, and that can cause stunted growth, mental retardation, or something called goiter. Overnutrition, again, we spoke about this earlier. Health problems from eating too much exist as well. So overnutrition is when excess body fat from too many calories and too little exercise. Similar health problems to those who are underfed. Believe it or not, those who are overfed tend to have some of the same health problems, as people who are underfed. Lower life expectancy, greater susceptibility to disease and illness, and lower productivity and lower life quality. So again, it's not only about eating too little, it's about eating too much as well. Poverty is the root cause of hunger and malnutrition, unfortunately. Half of the world's people struggle to survive on $2.25 a day on food. Think about that for a second. Think about what you do with $2.25, right? I'll be honest with you. We cooked steak last night in my house, and my daughter decided she wasn't going to eat at home. So I had a leftover half a rung of steak, and I threw it in the garbage, probably worth about $5 or $6. That's my bad. Okay, it's my bad. I just couldn't eat anymore. And my wife and my son, we couldn't eat anymore. But think about that, right? That $5 or $6 could have fed 3 or 4 people around the world. So these are the things you need to think about when you if you throw food away or you waste your money. Think about it. Half of the world's people struggle to survive on $2.25 US dollars worth of food per day. Poverty prevents daily access to nutritious food. Other obstacles to food security, which we spoke about: war, corruption, bad weather, and of course, climate change. So how is food produced? Okay, so we talk about how we need to increase the food supply in many parts of the world because, especially in underdeveloped countries, there isn't enough food out there. Well, we have used high input industrialized agriculture and low input traditional agriculture to greatly increase food supplies. So what we're going to find is that we have, over the past 50 to 70 years, greatly increased the food supplies. But now what we're realizing is that high input industrialized agriculture is unfortunately ruining the environment. So we have to change things up just a bit here. So once again, food production has increased dramatically. 3 systems produce most of our food. Number 1, croplands. All right, our croplands produce our grains. Those are your rice, your wheat, your corn. We have our rangelands, our pastures, and our feedlots. They're going to produce meat and meat products. And then we have fisheries and aquaculture, which will provide fish products. So those are the 3 ways that most of our food is produced. And important technological advances has helped increase the yield, right? Or how much food is being produced: irrigation, synthetic fertilizers, and pesticides. Industrialized crop production, though, relies on high input monocultures. And this is now where we begin to see problems with the environment. So what is industrialized agriculture? Industrialized agriculture is not your mom and pop type of farm. What they are big company run farms. Right? They use heavy equipment. They use large amounts of financial capital, fossil fuels, water, inorganic fertilizers, and pesticides. They produce just one single crop. And we've spoke about how when you have monoculture or just one crop, it's a killer for biodiversity. The major goal of industrialized agriculture is to steadily increase your crop yield. You want to continue to get more and more yield out of your crop. The more yield you get, the more people are fed and the more money you make, right? So in a way, it's a win-win situation. But what we're finding out, it's a losing situation in many respects for the environment when we talk about this industrial agriculture. And as we go through this lecture, part 1 and part 2, we'll talk about reasons why industrialized agriculture isn't the greatest for our environment. Plantation agriculture, those are your cash crops. This is primarily in less developed countries, like a tobacco, like cotton. All right, these would be your cash crops. So what are we looking at here? Well, we're looking at wheat crops, right? And this is your industrialized agriculture. That is a heavy machinery, right? That is harvesting the wheat here. And again, all you see for miles and miles, if you look at this picture, is just wheat. So that's what we talk about with high input monoculture. So what is low input polyculture? Well, that's more of your traditional agriculture. This is what you think about when you think about shows like Little House on the Prairie. I don't know if you guys watched that. It was a show that was on in the 80s, 1980s. It talks about the 1800s. That's more of your traditional agriculture. This is traditional subsistence agriculture, human labor and draft animals, all right, for family food. So again, they're not trying to sell crops in a traditional agriculture way. This isn't about money. This is just about feeding your family. Traditional intensive agriculture, this provides higher yields through increased labor, animal manure, and water. And then again, we have this polyculture. What is polyculture? Well, the opposite of monoculture, right? If mono is one, poly is many, and that's several crops grown on the same farm. And again, there are benefits to polyculture over monoculture, and we'll talk about those benefits more and more as we go through part 1 and part 2 of this lecture on chapter 12. So, organic agriculture, it's on the rise. I know you guys go to the supermarkets and you see that organic section, definitely on the rise in the last 10 to 15 years. What is organic agriculture? Well, it's crops that are grown without synthetic pesticides or fertilizers. No genetically engineered seed varieties either, okay? So no GMOs are allowed to be in organic. They have to be totally natural. Animals must be raised with 100% organic feed without antibiotics or growth hormones. Organic agriculture is more labor intensive than conventionally produced food, and obviously it costs more. So that's why those organic bananas are $2.99 a pound, while the regular bananas are 99 cents a pound, right? They're more expensive because they're more labor intensive to produce real, true organic agriculture. So here are some of the kind of the differences between industrialized agriculture and organic agriculture. Industrialized uses synthetic inorganic fertilizers and sewage sludge to supply plant nutrients. Organic, they emphasize prevention of soil erosion and the use of organic fertilizers such as animal manure and compost, but no sewage sludge to supply the plant nutrients. Industrialized agriculture makes use of those synthetic chemical pesticides. Again, these are pesticides synthetic that we are creating. Okay, humans create these pesticides. They're not natural. All right, in organic, you're using more natural pesticides, which we call, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Basically, natural pesticides are usually insects that eat the pests, and we'll talk about how in part 2 how that's important. Industrialized agriculture again use conventional and genetically modified seeds. You don't get that in organic agriculture. Industrialized agriculture depends on non-renewable fossil fuels, right? Mostly oil and natural gas. In organic, you reduce that fossil fuel use and increase the use of renewable energy, such as solar and wind power. Industrialized agriculture produces significant air and water pollution and greenhouse gases. Organic, you're going to produce less of those pollutants. Industrialized agriculture is globally export oriented. Again, export, make money. People want to buy it. Organic, regionally and locally oriented. You just want to buy stuff that's grown in your neighborhood. Industrialized agriculture uses antibiotics and growth hormones to produce meat and meat products. That's not happening in your organic agriculture. So once again, when you see one of these charts, definitely understand what's going on in each here so that you can pick off some of that if you need it for an FRQ. All right, so let's take a closer look now at industrialized crop production. So we talked about industrial and traditional. We're now going to look at the industrial in more detail. So we had something called the Green Revolution. All right, this happened in the early to mid 1900s. All right, basically, it took the traditional subsistence farming of the 1800s and turned them into these monocultures of high yield key crops like rice, wheat, and corn. We used large amounts of fertilizers, pesticides, and water, and we had multiple croppings, which means you have multiple harvests throughout the year. This was the Green Revolution, and it was the greatest thing that happened to us at the time because we were having a tough time feeding all the people on the planet. All of a sudden now we came up with this green revolution, right? We have these big monocultures with industrialized fertilizer, pesticides. This was the greatest thing, right? In the 40s, 50s, and 60s, back in the 1900s, right? Here we now were able to produce all this food for all these people, all right? But now we're finding out, 50, 60, 70 years later of the consequences of this. Then we had a second green revolution, which happened a little bit later. And this is when we started using genetically modified or genetically we're changing the genes, right? We're changing the genetics, or we're doing some crossbreeding or things like that to provide us with fast-growing varieties of food. In this case, rice and wheat. So that was the second green revolution, where we figured out how to splice genes, right, and how to again either produce hybrids or to produce GMOs, genetically modified organisms, which now allowed us to produce this food even faster, at a faster rate, with even higher yields. That was the second green revolution. So the first one was basically doing the industrialized agriculture, fertilizers, pesticides, water, monoculture. We get all this food. Second one, hybrids, GMOs, to produce even faster growing varieties so that now we can even produce much more food. And as a result, the world grain production tripled between 1950 in 2014 because of all this. But again, now that we're taking a more closer look, we're realizing that a lot of what we thought initially was going to save us, we thought this was going to save the planet, right? This is it. Now we can feed everyone. We're good to go. We're realizing now, 50, 60 years later, that may not actually be the case. So what we're looking at here is this is total grain production on the left. And you'll notice from 1950 up, that total grain production continues to increase. On the right is per capita. So that's total grain per person. And you'll notice that has kind of fluctuated a little bit because of all the excess people that we're putting on this planet. We talked about that in the population chapter a couple of weeks ago. All right. So that's kind of what we're looking at here. Left is total grain population. Right is per capita. All right. So we look at a core case study here, industrialized food production in the U.S. We have something called Agribusiness, which are a few giant multinational corporations that control the growing, processing, distribution, and sale of food in this country. Food production is very efficient. All right. Again, we create it now, but unfortunately, as we'll talk about as we go through the rest of this lecture, that the industrialized food production, again, is hurting the environment. But Americans spend about 9% of their income on food. The actual cost of food much higher, again, full cost pricing, right? Hidden costs of subsidies, pollution, and the environmental degradation, not going into that food price, again, and that's one of the issues that we've talked about, that full cost pricing in this course. So let's talk about crossbreeding and genetic engineering. This produces new varieties of crops and livestock. So again, that first gene revolution, which was the crossbreeding through artificial selection. This was a slow process, but had amazing results. So this would be where you would maybe have two types of tomatoes growing next to one another. One is a fast growing variety. One is really, really red, right? You take some pollen from one, put it in the other, and hopefully over time, it takes time, a couple of generations. But the whole idea was that if you crossbreed a nice juicy red one with a fast growing one that maybe wasn't as juicy as red, you would come up with a perfect tomato, juicy red and growing fast, right? So that was the first gene revolution. That was, again, crossbreeding, all right? Just basically taking pollen from one, putting it in the other, and hoping for the best. And again, the results were amazing. It just took time. Now, the second gene revolution involves genetic engineering, all right? So these are your GMOs we talk about. This actually alters the organism's DNA. So genetically modified organisms or transgenic organisms have actually had their DNA modified by putting the DNA from something else that you would want in that organism, right? You have an organism over here, you want that trait in this organism, so you take the DNA out of here and you shove it into the cell in this organism, and then that organism grows with the traits of each. That is GMO. That is what genetically modified organisms are all about. So again, the first one, crossbreeding, they started doing that in ancient Egypt, right? 2,000, 3,000 years ago, we have evidence of crossbreeding through artificial selection, right? We selecting things. Past 50 years or so, 40, 50 years, we've come up with this GMOs or genetically engineering. This is the second gene revolution. And again, in this, we alter an organism's DNA to actually make it more with the traits that we want it to have. Okay, moving on. Meat consumption has grown steadily. So now we're kind of moving off of the industrialized agriculture for a minute. And now we're going to talk about the industrialized meat consumption or meat production that, again, we then eat as consumption. So meat production has increased more than sixfold between 1950 and 2010. Pork, poultry, and beef are the top products. Increased demand for grain because you have all these animals now. So that has a greater reliance on grain imports like China. About half of the world's meat is raised on rangeland, the other half in the factory farm system. All right. So again, 50% of world's meat on those rangelands we talked about, right? What are rangelands? Just unfenced areas that cattle are allowed to graze in. All right, half of the world's there, but now about half of the world's meat are actually produced in the factory farm system, which is basically industrialized meat production. So you'll notice here on the left, there's your meat production going back to 1950, again, steadily increasing. On the right shows the U.S. versus China. And as you can see, our meat production kind of leveling off a little bit, but China's has erupted over the past, let's say, 30, 40 years or so. China really, really using a lot of meat. This is an industrialized meat farm, guys. So what we're looking at here is thousands of cattle that just sit there. They're fattened on grain for a bunch of months, and then they're slaughtered. And that's it. And it just goes on and on and on. And about half of the world's meat is produced this way you're seeing right here, not by cattle roaming free on the range, but in this industrialized farm-like setting for cattle here. All right. And again, we'll talk about how there are issues when it comes to the environment from raising cattle and dealing with these industrialized meat plants. All right, moving on. Again, kind of getting little tidbits of those three types of food production. Now we talk about fish and shellfish production, and they're growing rapidly as well. So what is a fishery? A fishery is a concentration of a particular species suitable for commercial harvesting. 30%, and these are basically just areas in the ocean. Okay, where a specific type of fish like to live, or shellfish like to live. We call it a fishery. About 30% of the world's fisheries, however, are overfished, and about 50% of them are already harvested at full capacity. So again, we're kind of degrading our fisheries out there. So what are we doing because of that? Well, we come up with something called aquaculture, which is basically fish farming. So if you think of the cattle, you think of the rangelands, right, where 50% of the cattle, you can think of the rangelands would be equal to the fisheries, right? This is where fish, fisheries where they normally live. We go in and we kind of, we harvest them. Aquaculture is going to be like that industrialized meat farm I showed you. This is basically fish farming. And the amount of fish and shellfish produced globally through aquaculture has increased 12-fold from 1980 to 2014. The wild catch has leveled off and actually declined because we've overfished our fisheries. That's the wild catch. Right? So now we're more reliable on these aquaculture or these fish farms, farming of meat-eating species growing rapidly, and they're actually fed fish meal or fish oil produced from other fish. All right? So for these aquacultures, you need fish to kill, to feed other fish. So it's basically a kind of snowball effect going on here. And again, you'll notice, just looking at the chart, aquaculture basically non-existent through the early 1980s. And then it has rapidly increased while the wild catch has definitely leveled off because, again, we're overfishing many of our fisheries. Okay, so now we've spoken about the three ways that people get food, and we've talked about how in all three ways, there's more of a traditional way, and there's more of that industrialized way. So the industrialized food production requires huge inputs of energy, and here is where the problems begin. Okay, with your industrialized agriculture, your industrialized meat production, and even your industrialized fish production. Okay, it's the fact that you need large inputs of energy. That's why we call it high input industrialized agriculture. Okay, because you need high input of energy initially. So mostly non-renewable energy is used, oil and natural gas. Think about what runs all the equipment on the farms, right? It's gas, right? So it's oil. It's what runs all the stuff that you use to harvest these crops. It's going to be done on non-renewable energy. And in fact, 10 units of fossil fuel energy is used for every 1 unit of food energy in the United States. So think about that. You produce 1 unit of food, you need 10 units of fossil fuels to produce that 1 energy of food. So again, not a good ratio there. The amount of energy per calorie used in the US has declined 50% since the 1970s. So that is some good news. But that's mainly because there's less energy required to produce nitrogen fertilizer, and there is the rising use of something called conservation tillage, which we will get into a little bit later. So that's why the amount of energy has declined almost half since the 1970s. So that's good news, but unfortunately it is still rather high. So what are the environmental effects of industrialized food production? Well, we talked about one, right? Using too many fossil fuels, and you know what that leads to, air and water pollution. But there's also soil erosion and degradation. Desertification occurs. That's when you turn an area into a desert. Irrigation water shortages, again, the air and water pollution, climate change, and loss of biodiversity when you produce those monocultures, right? You're just destroying the biodiversity there. So, industrialized agriculture has harmful environmental impacts. They use about 70% of the fresh water removed from aquifers and surface waters worldwide are used in industrialized agriculture, in producing food, either in the agriculture or the meat production or the fish production, all right, in industrialized food production, all right, or in this case, we are talking about agriculture, but again, could be talking about the meat, could be talking about the fish as well. So industrialized agriculture, 70% of fresh water removed from aquifers and surface waters, not going for people to drink and have fresh water. No, it's going into producing food. Industrialized agriculture emits 25% or a quarter of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. It also produces 60% of all of the water pollution that we have on this planet is a direct result of industrialized agriculture. So think about that. Again, we thought we solved all our problems 70 years ago with that first green revolution. Here we go. We can produce all this food. And now we're realizing that we're killing our fresh water or using it up. We're polluting our air. with this industrialized agriculture, and we're producing more than half of the world's water pollution because of the industrialized agriculture. So again, here's just some more of the natural capital degradation that we can get from this industrialized food production. I would definitely understand and know a bit of this chart here. So biodiversity loss, right? Conversions of grasslands, forests, and wetlands to crops or rangelands. Fish kills from pesticides, runoff, killing of wild predators to protect livestock, and loss of agro biodiversity replaced by those monocultural strains like wheat, right? Like palm oil, like those palm trees, right? Palm oil, like rice, etc. Soil, erosion, loss of fertility, salinization, which is when your soil becomes too salty for plants to be able to grow, waterlogging, and desertification. We'll talk more about those in a bit. Water, again, aquifer depletion. We spoke about that. Increased runoff, sediment pollution, flooding from cleared land, pollution from pesticides, and algae blooms and fish kills caused by runoff of fertilizers and farm waste, right? That's your eutrophication we spoke about in previous chapters. Air pollution, emissions of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide from fossil fuel use, nitrous oxide from inorganic fertilizer use, and methane from cattle. Yes, cattle fart methane, guys. And there's so many of those cattle, right? In those industrialized meat farm that we're actually increasing the methane concentration in the air because of cows farting. Too many cows are farting, and the methane is increasing, and methane is a greenhouse gas. Actually, it's the number one anthropomorphically produced. That means produced by humans, greenhouse gas. Other air pollutants from fossil fuels and pesticide sprays, and then human health. There, nitrates in drinking water, which produces something called blue babies, pesticide residue in water, food, and air, livestock waste in drinking and swimming water, and bacterial contamination of meat. So again, all issues because of producing food in an industrialized way. Excuse me. All right, about 10 slides left. All right, so let's talk about some of these in a bit more detail. So first, let's talk about topsoil erosion. It is a serious problem. So what is soil erosion? It's the movement of soil by wind and water. There are natural causes of soil erosion like flooding. There's also human causes of soil erosion like industrialized agriculture. Excuse me. 3 major harmful effects of soil erosion. Loss of soil fertility, because if you remember from the previous chapter, all of your humus, that dark, real rich soil is on the top. So when you erode that, you lose your fertility of the soil. You get water pollution because, believe it or not, excess sediment in water is considered water pollution. So even if the sediment doesn't have chemicals in it, doesn't have pesticides in it, even if it's just plain sediment, that's still considered water pollution because you have all this sediment clogging up streams. And there's a release of carbon stored in the soil as carbon dioxide, which unfortunately adds to the greenhouse gases. So here's a picture. This is erosion by wind in Iowa. And you can just see how you can't grow anything there anymore because the soil's not fertile, because that humus, right? That dark, rich, fertile soil in the O horizon is gone. It has been moved away. So now you have useless land here that it becomes a serious problem. And if you look at a picture here of the world, where you see red is where there are serious erosion concerns. And blue has just some concerns. And you'll notice most of the earth has either some or serious soil erosion concerns. And many of these areas are where you have your industrialized agriculture, right? The Midwest of the U.S., the breadbasket of Europe here, as they call it, the central part of Europe. All right. So again, these are where you see your industrialized agriculture and where you're seeing topsoil erosion as a major problem. Drought and human activities are also degrading our land. So something called desertification. This is when productive potential of topsoil falls by 10% or more, caused by prolonged drought and human activities. It's basically when an area turns into a desert. Human agriculture accelerates desertification. All right. And if you remember your history lesson back in the 20s and 30s, you had the Dust Bowl in the central US, but there has been Dust Bowls all over the world over the years. And that's when severe wind erosion of topsoil produces dust in the air, obviously. So that's not only terrible for human health, but also, again, you're taking all your topsoil, your fertile topsoil, and blowing it away, making the land basically useless. In addition, excessive irrigation can pollute soil and water. Believe it or not, the more you water something, the more you degrade the soil. So something called soil salinization occurs. This is the gradual accumulation of salts in the soil from irrigation water. This lowers crop yield and eventually kills plants, and it affects about 10% of the world's cropland. So what? In water, okay, there's actually some natural salts in that water. So as you continue to water land and irrigate it, those salts add up in the soil. Well, the water evaporates or is used up by the plants, but the salts are just left there. And so over time, the salts actually lower your crop yield and eventually get to a point where the plants are killed, and so you can't even use that cropland anymore. And about 10% of the world's croplands are actually rendered useless because of this soil salinization. In addition, waterlogging. Irrigation water gradually raises the water table in an area, and this can deprive plants of oxygen, and this too affects about 10% of the world's cropland. So believe it or not, overwatering is a big problem as well. You don't want to overwater plants. And a lot of times with these industrialized irrigation systems, eventually over time, the water or the area gets waterlogged, and then you can't grow crops either, right? So again, all these things that we thought were our saving grace, right? We finally got it. We finally figured out how to produce all this food. Now, years later, we're realizing it's not good. We're killing our croplands with this soil salinization, with this waterlogging as well, all right? And now the world's croplands are being affected. So now, unfortunately, yields can go down, right? Yields can actually go down if this continues, because right now 10% of the world's croplands are affected. Down the road, 20%. Down the road, 30%, right? And so if we don't change things, eventually we won't have any cropland suitable to grow plants. And here you go. This is what it looks like. These are white salts that has displaced crops in Colorado. And you'll notice the ground is white because of the irrigation of the salts that have accumulated. And that is basically salinization right there. And you can't grow crops anymore, or you have to then mitigate the soil, and it takes years and years to get the salt out of the soil so you can finally grow crops again. Industrialized crop production contributes to pollution and climate change. So now, again, we're talking about all these things in a bit more detail. Eroded topsoil flows into streams. We talked about that. Aquatic organisms then ingest the pesticide residues or just deal with the extra topsoil. Or maybe it's the fertilizer, right, that caused the eutrophication, the algae blooms. Farmers contribute to pollution through fertilizing. Nitrates contaminate groundwater used for drinking. Agricultural activities comprise more than 25% of human-generated carbon dioxide emissions. Think about that. When we think about carbon dioxide, right, you think about your cars, right? We talk about, we're driving too many cars, or we're heating our homes with air conditioning. 25% of the human-generated carbon dioxide emissions in the world is because of agricultural activities. Think about that. That's a large number, and you probably never thought that, right? You probably never thought that growing that food produced this much carbon dioxide emissions, but it does. Producing food and biofuels also reduce biodiversity. So what's biofuel? That's like ethanol, right, from corn, but you need acres and acres and acres and acres and acres of corn to be able to produce this biofuel. So biodiversity is threatened when forest and grasslands are replaced with croplands, especially if we're talking about monoculture croplands, where you just have one type of crop, crop. Agrobiodiversity. This is a genetic variety of animal and plant species used on farms to produce food. 75% of that agrobiodiversity has been lost since 1900, and that's because of the green revolutions. Again, we thought by growing these monoculture, we figured it out. We're going to feed everyone, and unfortunately, we've lost our biodiversity, or a lot of it, because of that. Efforts to save endangered crop species. We do have some refrigerated seed banks that we are using now. Talk about the genetically engineered food. There is some controversy. This will be the last two slides, and then we'll end part one. So genetic engineering could help improve food security. Again, this is by actually changing the DNA, right, of certain species to make them more suitable to what we want. However, little is known about the long-term health effects. For instance, Bt toxins could trigger an inflammatory response in our bodies. Potential environmental effects of genetically modified populations in the wild. This could create hybrids with natural organisms. That could also be an issue, or at least a controversy, right? You have these organisms that are genetically modified. Do you then put them back into the environment with natural organisms? Could that lead to some issues? Again, these are the controversies with genetically engineered food. So here are some benefits and drawbacks from your genetically modified crops and foods. And again, this will be the last slide for part one. Potential benefits: may need less fertilizer, pesticides, and water, can be resistant to insects, disease, frost, and drought. Because again, we're creating exactly what we want here. They can grow faster and could raise yields. They may tolerate higher levels of herbicides, and they could have a longer shelf life. Drawbacks: have unpredictable genetic and ecological effects, may put toxins in food, could repel or harm pollinators like bees, can promote pesticide-resistant insects, herbicide-resistant weeds, and plant disease, and they could disrupt seed markets and reduce biodiversity. So again, these are some of the controversies out there over genetically engineered food. All right, so that concludes part one of my lecture on chapter 12, which is food production and the environment. Make sure to tune in for part two, and as always, thanks for listening.